A very warm welcome to the London School of Economics for this online public event. I'm your chair for today. My name is Dr. Shalini Grover, and I'm an anthropologist and a research fellow at the International Inequalities Institute, which we call the III. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today Professor Rhacel Parreñas, Lina Abou Habib, and Dr. Steffen Hertog, a stellar panel of experts on the Middle East, one that we've eagerly awaited for. Our guest speaker today, Rhacel, is the Florence Eveline Professor of Sociology, Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Southern California and currently a visiting professor at Princeton. Rhacel needs no introduction. She's truly one of the pioneers of global care chain ethnography. Her first book, Servants of Globalization, Migration and Domestic Work, published in 2001 by Stanford University Press, is a landmark study that is now in a second edition. It is a deeply theoretically sophisticated analysis of racialized women from the spatial location of the Philippines to where the spatial location becomes global, such as Rome and LA. After Servants of Globalization, Rhacel has also published 4 other monographs, including the one we'll discuss today. Rhacel's work also extends to many other frontiers. She's winner of the Jesse Bernard Award in recognition of scholarly work that has enlarged the horizons of sociology to encompass fully the role of women in society. So Rhacel, a very warm welcome to the LSE, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Next, we are delighted to have with us Lina Abou Habib, who is director of the Asfari Institute of Civil Society and Citizenship at the American University of Beirut. She also teaches gender courses at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and is the Gender Project Director for the AUB program. She's a member of the editorial committee of the Gender and Development Journal published by Oxfam. Indeed, many of Lina's articles, such as How the Journey Began in Beijing to Introduction to Citizenship, are all widely read in the Gender and Development Journal. So Lina, a very warm welcome and greatly appreciate your expertise today. It's a great pleasure to introduce to you Steffen Hertog, an Associate Professor of Comparative Politics at the LSE. His research interests include Gulf politics, Middle East political economy, political violence, and radicalization. He's been researching the political economy of migrant labor in the GCC and is a key advisor to the ILO and the World Bank. He was lead researcher for an ILO report that provided the analytical backdrop for the liberalization of the Qatari labor sponsorship system in 2020. With his rich and wide range of experience in the Middle East, we're very lucky to have Steffen with us today. So thank you for joining. So moving on to the structure of today's public event, after Rhacel's talk, our diverse panel will offer their reflections on her book. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSEIII. This is an online event that's being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast. As usual, there'll be a chance for you in the Q&A to ask questions, to pose questions, and please put your name and affiliation when you do that. We're very keen to hear from our students and LSE alumni. So please let us know if you are alumni or students. We will put a link to Rhacel's book in the chat. So if you're interested, you can purchase it. And before I hand you over to Rhacel, I'd very much like to thank Peter and Emma and all of you from the III for impeccably developing today's public event and for all your generous support. I'm now delighted to hand you over to Rhacel for her book today. Thank you, Rhacel.
So thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here and being willing to hear about my most recent work, which is this book, Unfree, on migrant domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates. So I'm just going to informally introduce the book to you. And so I began this book with this question concerning or centered on the legal subjectivity of migrant domestic workers as unfree workers. And so according to the ILO, of all labor migrants, the largest group are migrant domestic workers. They constitute, according to the ILO, and they estimate that about 25% of all labor trafficking victims are domestic workers. And most of these domestic workers can be found in Asia, including in West Asia, including in Gulf Cooperation Council countries. And so it's the legal status of migrant domestic workers that make them particularly vulnerable to human trafficking, which by definition, it's very specific. It's referring basically to the transportation of a group from one location to another and that they are duped in that process. And then third, for the purpose of their exploitation, and that exploitation could be slavery, servitude, forced labor. And so migrant domestic workers are particularly vulnerable to forced labor, servitude, and enslavement. And so, and this is because across the globe, migrant domestic workers pretty much share the same legal status of being infantilized workers. And that is usually their visa status or their legal status is contingent on their continuous employment for only one employer as a live-in worker. And they are unable to easily change their jobs. So even if they face an abusive situation, it's very hard for them to change their jobs, even if they wish to get deported. And because of this legal status, I think it's then concluded that they are likely vulnerable to extreme abuse. And indeed they are. So I want to say that this legal status is something that people associate mostly with, the MENA region, the Middle East. They think of it as happening in countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, which is my field site. But I do want to say that while this happens in this region, it's also mirrors their legal status in other countries. Israel, historically Canada, we could say the same for au pairs in countries like Denmark and in various destinations in Asia. But what makes the Gulf Cooperation Council countries get more attention is arguably the greater challenge for migrant domestic workers to change jobs. And this is because in this region of the world, they need to secure their employer's permission in order to change jobs. So even if you're an abused domestic worker and you want to quit, you basically have to secure permission of your employer to quit, change jobs, or even leave the country. And employers, admittedly, are not incentivized to quote unquote free the domestic workers, and it is because they usually pay anywhere from $3,600 to more to secure the employment of a domestic worker in their home for a minimum of 2 years. So if this domestic worker, even if they mistreated them, wish to quit, they're hard pressed to allow them to quit because they don't want to lose that $3,600 that they paid the agency to get this domestic worker in their home. So I then focused on figuring out, well, what happens? So my question really is, how do we understand, what comes out of this extremely asymmetric relationship between an employer and employee in the private space of a home that is unlikely to be regulated by the state? And that if there are labor protection of any kind, it is highly unlikely that it could be enforced because there's like no regulation. So I'm not the first scholar to look into this, especially in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries or neighboring countries such as Lebanon. In the other studies that preceded mine, there is, however, a kind of agreement among scholars that this legal status that I just described to you is going to result in structural violence, or human trafficking, or slavery. And so those are the three terms that circulate a lot in the scholarship on domestic workers in the region. So while I recognize that these vulnerabilities could occur, I was also like kind of wondering, I felt that was too simple of a conclusion. And indeed, like my peers observed in their studies, that labor conditions for domestic workers in that region don't necessarily result in very abusive conditions. Yet, they've opted to sort of, put that, sweep that under the rug, because, and sort of leave it as sort of make it out as an exception, and saying, well, and arguing that the vast majority get oppressed somehow. So I think that they can also so I'll say something about methods. I think that's very easy to conclude because many studies do convenience sampling, as they rely tremendously on migrant shelters to identify potential interviewees for their studies. So of course, you're gonna get the vast majority of domestic workers who are oppressed if you're oversampling from these migrant shelters. And so for me, I avoided that consciously, and I was able to then get a more diverse sample of domestic workers that included those with a day off, those without a day off, those who have been working there for a long time, and those who are recent arrivees. And the people I interviewed, they were all from the Philippines, and which is the majority of domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates. And the people I interviewed worked for a diverse range of employers that included Emirati, other Arabs, Indians, South Asians, Lebanese, was a kind of Iranians was another big group, and Westerners. And I found that you could actually find people with not the most ideal work situations if you interview them, for example, in supermarket aisles where you'll meet people without days off, and they usually shop at the same time every day, so you could do incremental interviews with them. And I also met them in public parks at like 5 in the morning when they were walking dogs. And so if you diversify, like if you're creative, temporally creative, I found it out in terms of how you try to access people who otherwise would be like hidden in the home, then you need not just like kind of scream at them from like the ground floor while they're up in the basement of their, while they're up in the balcony of their employer's house, which is what some other scholars have had to do. And so I wanted then to, recognize how the people who are subject to these laws, who find themselves in an asymmetrical relationship vis-a-vis one another, and that's the employer and the employee, I wanted to recognize them as an agentic subject, and that I wanted to recognize that in this world, people respond differently in diverse ways to the situations that they found themselves in. And indeed, my data shows that. And then I tried to figure out how my findings make sense, right, theoretically. So let me get into my findings. And so one main finding I had, that there are multiple actors involved in the management of migrant domestic work, and that many actors and agents are conscious of the asymmetrical relationship that the law puts the employers and domestic workers in relation to one another. And so those actors are like the Philippine government, the United Arab Emirates government, different NGOs, the ILO, multilateral agencies, and the employers themselves, and then agencies that funnel the movement of domestic workers from the Philippines to different countries in the world. And that in their management of the migration of domestic workers, morals, I found, really shapes how they address the inequality that arises, that people find themselves in. And these morals mediate the relationship then that domestic workers and employers have with one another. And so oftentimes then, when employers manage domestic workers, they've often heard in CNN about some ILO report, some Human Rights Watch report, and they either ignore that report or it's conscious in their head when they're managing this domestic worker. Likewise, they are informed by what migrant recruitment agencies have told them. A lot of times employers are, unless they have, they're much older, a lot of them are younger employers who'd never employed someone. And so then they're seeking advice from people. And usually those are the recruitment agents on how to treat their domestic workers. And then finally, they also rely on their peers, as Pierrette Handanusa-Tello showed in her book, Domestica. So domestic workers also enter this space with particular sort of moral standards that they use to gauge the quality of their employment. And so for domestic workers, it's primarily the Philippine government that shapes how they feel or how they think their employment conditions are. So before they leave, they have to take this seminar, and for people going to the Middle East to become domestic workers, it's 3 days. And during those 3 days, they learn about standards such as you should make $400 a month, you should have 8 hours of continuous rest day every 24 hours, you need to eat 3 meals a day, you need to, you're entitled by law to a rest day every 7, per week. So they come in with those standards, and then they accordingly, gauge what their conditions are. And so then, again, so this leads to sort of the moral mediation of the labor conditions, of the labor. So what did I find then? So what is the result of this moral mediation? I found that employers respond and domestic workers respond to this asymmetric relationship in multiple ways, that you end up with such a diverse range of employment conditions. So you will meet domestic workers without a day off, those without a day off, those with a day off. You'll meet domestic workers whose employers bar them from having access to the internet or the phone. Then you have domestic workers who have free reign to talk to their children through a web app that they can then use with their headphones as they're cleaning. They're talking to their children. You have employers who limit what domestic workers can eat, and you have domestic workers who find themselves being able to eat anything they want. So I found a much more diverse range of employment conditions than what I read in the literature, before I did the study. And so I found generally that there are 3 cultures of employment in domestic work in the United Arab Emirates. And so, you could describe these three cultures as one. There's households that recognize the humanity and personhood of the domestic worker. Second, you have households that infantilize domestic workers. And then third, you have households that dehumanize domestic workers. And so there's many ways we could measure labor conditions of domestic workers. We could measure it by looking at, what work they do, the hours of work they have to do, whether they have a day off or not, whether they have access to communication or not, whether they have bodily autonomy, that they can just determine how to do their work, or are they micromanaged? They can wear what they want, or they're being told what to wear, or it's also determined. We could also look at employment conditions by looking at the food that they eat. And so for me, what was very interesting was for domestic workers, they primarily measured their employment conditions based on how much food they have access to and what kind of food they eat. So let me now describe the three cultures of employment by talking about the different foods they could eat and they were able to eat. So we have, let me start with employers that recognize the humanity of domestic workers. So you have employers who actually, let domestic workers eat whatever they want to eat. And they usually do this by first giving them free rein in the kitchen, basically telling domestic workers that they can eat whatever they want, whatever they see in the kitchen, that they need not ask permission to pick up that banana, that they could just eat that banana. And then a second thing that they could, do is give domestic workers an allowance. And so usually when they give them an allowance, it's to add to their access to the food, because the employers are not necessarily buying the foods that the domestic workers prefer to eat. And then a third thing is that employers will, oftentimes ask domestic workers what they like to eat and give them, buy it when they go shopping, or because the domestic worker is the one shopping for food. So then they, because they're the ones shopping for food, it's like there's an understanding that they could just buy whatever that they want. So while that's the case, I should say this is not signaling that employers and domestic workers are equal to each other, that domestic workers know that there's sort of a boundary that they can't cross. And so, for example, if there's an uneaten piece of cake, they know not to eat it. Or if there's, some gourmet thing that's expensive in the region, like manchego cheese, they know not to eat it. And employers, interestingly, even if they're humanitarian in how they feed their domestic workers, it's not necessarily because they are altruistic. Oftentimes it's they're morally, their actions are monitored or, shaped by, what they think are moral standards. Sorry, I have this crying baby in the background. So, but it's the employers kind of have this moral gauge, that, moral standard that they know they have to abide with. So I have this one employer that we interviewed that was complaining to my team, basically saying that her domestic worker buys shrimp every week because the domestic worker eats the top ramen, and then she likes to put shrimps in her top ramen. And the employer gets so annoyed that she does that, feels that the domestic worker is so entitled to just buy these shrimps. But, when we asked her, is she going to say something to the domestic worker? She was like, no, because she knew that she would look like a bad person if she controlled and limited what the domestic worker could buy. So again, you have these humanitarian employers who let domestic workers eat whatever they want to eat, and these are the ideal employers. But then I want to say that they're not necessarily acting out of altruism, but it's more kind of morals are kind of shaping how they should behave. Then you have a second group or a second culture that we find, which is those who are those who infantilize their domestic workers. And so infantilization happens when employers let domestic workers eat let domestic workers eat 3 meals a day, but they don't necessarily ever ask domestic workers what kind of foods they prefer to eat. They give zero consideration to the palate of the domestic worker. And so, it's like they infantilize them, kind of like kids. You tell kids is what's good for you, and you tell kids what they should be eating. And so some employers treat their domestic workers that way. And oftentimes, this is like an acceptable condition for domestic workers, especially say when they have Lebanese employers, because they say Lebanese food is usually delicious. But then sometimes the foods that the employers eat don't align with the preferences of the domestic worker. And this often happens when employers are vegetarian or employers have a preference for spicy food. And that usually often leads to domestic workers finding themselves kind of bordering dehumanization in terms of the kinds of foods that they have access to. And then a third kind of household are households, and this is the worst, and these are households that dehumanize domestic workers. And we see that when they limit domestic workers to only eating 1 meal a day. We also see this when employers just give them leftovers to eat. And, domestic workers don't passively accept this condition. They usually will complain to employers, but employers, domestic workers realize, dehumanize them and are very racist against them. In one case, I have an interviewee who told me that when she complained to her employers about needing to eat more than 1 meal a day, the employer basically told her, you're not Filipino, you're not Emirati, you're just a Filipino. So if you die, I'll just put you in the garbage can, right? So, I think Emiratis are more likely to do this because they fear the law less than other people in the Emirates. And so then they feel they're not likely to be punished for their bad behavior. And it's usually actually the older generation who are likely to do this. And so they're the ones who were, kind of adults when slavery was still legal in the country. And usually there's a conflict between generations in Emirati households about this. And so you find younger Emirati sneaking food into the domestic workers' room to, basically kind of protest how their in-laws are locking the refrigerator so domestic workers don't have access to food. And, but it's not only Emiratis who do this, other Arabs in my sample were doing this as well. And so the problem of limited food, however, is not something you could determine by class, where it's poor people are not feeding their domestic workers. That's not necessarily true. I did find that those who fear the law less are more likely to do this than others. And so Westerners are not likely to starve their domestic workers because of their temporary membership in that society. They're very much afraid of the law. And so then, I don't have time to really talk about the theoretical implications, but, what I do want to show is that we have to basically just, look at, domestic workers and employers as agentic subjects, and our job as sociologists is to look at how people negotiate the structures that they, face. And unfortunately, my colleagues have kind of not done that so well, and that they've basically just reduced our understanding of domestic work in the region to the structures that shape them, and ignored how people negotiate and react to such structures. And unfortunately, sort of that simple intellectual argument has the inadvertent result of, providing a very Orientalist depiction of labor conditions in that region of the world. So let me end there.
Thank you, Rhacel, for the most fascinating and nuanced account of your book. I'm now going to pass the floor to Lina. Very welcome, Lina.
Thank you, Shalini, and thank you, Rhacel, and greeting everybody from Beirut. And Rhacel, thank you for this presentation and for this outlook, which, I mean, I've learned a lot from both perusing your research and also listening to your presentation. And I'm just going to make a few comments trying to link the kind of the approach and the findings of Rhacel, link it to or actually see what it means at the level of in a context like that of Lebanon, and also from an intersectional feminist perspective. And so I'm just going to make a few comments, not in a particular order, but the comments that for me came up very strongly as I was reading Rhacel's book, but also as I was listening to her right now. And again, I'm grounding my comments in the context of Lebanon. So essentially, let's start by saying that this movement of migrant women, domestic workers, to a country like Lebanon means really not moving to a better place. It's moving to a place which remains in a situation of post-conflict, a very unstable place, and a place where the economic degradation has meant that no matter what the condition of employments are, migrant women domestic workers have been impacted most by the context, the political, economic, and social context in Lebanon. So that's just to keep. That's one piece of the puzzle. And there's another point that struck me quite hard in the book and in the presentation is the looking at morals as shaping and mediating relationships, and also how do we understand inequalities vis-a-vis the morality, the moral construct or the moral mindset of employees. I also want to put this out there because I want to come back to it. So from the perspective of Lebanon, who are the stakeholders and why does this complicate the issue of morality? So on the one hand, there's the sending countries, the sending governments, and I would argue that the position, the well-being, the welfare of the migrant women domestic workers varies. How important this is felt from the perspective of the sending countries. I would say this is the best I can say is that it's uneven. The host country is a country that is dysfunctional, where there is solid, tangible, consistent evidence of abuse, racism, mistreatment, and violence against women, migrant women domestic workers. I would argue way more than male workers. Also, the complicity of law enforcement as part and parcel of this abuse, and also the employers themselves, whom with the whole network of employment agencies are actually structured, and for me as an intersectional feminist, I have to go back to structural injustice and structural oppression. It's actually structured in a way that is very conducive to any form of abuse. And of course, the migrant women domestic workers as agents, and I do appreciate the comment that their experiences of this form of employment vary. I totally appreciate this. And I totally appreciate the fact that we have to look at this in terms of diversity of migrant women domestic workers, diversity in terms of age, diversity in terms of their experiences of abuse or not, diversity in terms of where they come from, another form of diversity that we never talk about, but it is one of the determinants of abuse, is diversities in terms of sexuality and sexual identities, and then diversity in terms of what networks do they have they been able or allowed to develop, which are all, I think, factors in what is their labor experience, if I may say, look like. So basically, while I recognize that there are diverse employment experiences, all these intersectional factors actually shape this experience. But when we are in a situation where the law, the existing letter of the law, is one that facilitates, condones, and is conducive to experiences of abuse, oppression, etc., which make these experiences more like the more omnipresent than your individual experiences or isolated experiences, where actually these laws, and I mean by the law, the Kafala law, is a law that has been created, written, and put in implementation so that such situations of oppressions and inequality remain. And where, at least I'm talking from the perspective of Lebanon, where impunity is maintained and produced and reproduced. To be honest, this is, for me, is the issue. And I can only look at it from the perspective, what do we normalize in terms of labor experiences in other forms of work versus the experience of, versus being a domestic worker. And, I cannot, as a feminist, as an intersectional feminist, think within a framework of cultures of employers, because nobody in an employment situation should depend on the culture and morality of the employer. Nobody should be left to the whims of charity or character of an employer. That's why we have and otherwise it's very problematic. That's why we have labor laws. That's why we have trade unions. That's why people who work mobilize. Basically, something that we hardly see in this situation. And therefore, for me, Shalini, please tell me how, if I exceeded my time. That's why for me, and I will end in a couple of minutes. That's why for me it's very challenging, actually even more so uncomfortable for me to think in terms of the cultures of employers and the different experiences as an entry point to describe the situation or to understand the situation. Although I in no way deny the existence of this culture and how it impacts, etc. What I'm saying at the end of the day, yes, 2 minutes. What I'm saying is we must have rules of engagement that apply for any kind of work in any sector, be it, regular, any kind of employment. And the rules of engagement means that there are rights attached to every form of employment. And we have seen enough in the case of Lebanon, we have seen enough abuse to say that the good experiences, that's lovely, this is great, this is wonderful, but the context, the letter of the law, the Kafala system in itself can only be conducive to abuse. And let's remember, Kafala system is a system that applies for migrants, not for expats. And that's a major form of discrimination, which is unacceptable. And I would finish by saying, let's remember the ways in which migrant women, domestic workers, challenged the kafala system and have been historically challenged the system through rebellion, through mobilizations, through attempts, so far, I have to say, failed attempt to create independent, strong, robust trade unions. But actually, all this form of mobilization is basically telling us that the conditions of employment are not acceptable. And the fact is that we cannot rely on the morality and on the good faith and on the kindness of employers, same as we cannot rely on this in any form of employment or on the job market in general. Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Rhacel and Shalini, for this.
Thank you so much, Lina, for bringing such fascinating perspectives of intersectionality and your perspectives from Lebanon. Greatly appreciated. I now call upon Steffen to give his comments. Very welcome.
Thank you, Shalini. So I'll try to comment sort of from my own perspective, which is that of a comparative political economist who's worked on migrant labor markets, not with specific focus on domestic workers, but migrant labor markets in the Gulf in general. And I have to say the book is really very, very complementary to many things that I've written and researched from very different perspectives. And it's a great book that works on many different levels, from an institutional perspective, of the receiving states, of the sending states, to the household level, the perspective of the employers as well as the workers. So it's really very, very rich and very thought-provoking. And it's also, I think, emotionally very poignant. And it brought me back to some of my own experience when I was doing my project with the ILO in Doha. And me and some other people on the research team tried to speak to some more or less randomly chosen domestic workers in a shopping mall. We had domestic workers that were presented with by the Ministry of Labor, but we wanted to avoid sort of the selection bias of only speaking to handpicked interviewees. And so we managed to speak to some domestic workers sort of casually in a shopping mall. And so we tried to sort of ease the atmosphere by, obviously this was all voluntary, and we explained that it would all be confidential, and we tried to ease the atmosphere by inviting them just to a local coffee stand to buy them a coffee and offer them a piece of cake. And not a single one of them during the whole conversation, which was extremely rich and fascinating, dared to even touch their drink or dared to touch the food that we bought for them, because there was such a strong sense of social hierarchy between us as sort of professional white-collar expats and those domestic workers. It was a really inadvertently very awkward situation that kind of brought home the extreme social hierarchies that are involved there, and that they're hard to overcome, even I think if you want to. And the stories they were heartbreaking, of women who'd been in the country for many years, whose husband worked, if husbands worked a few hundred meters away, but they were prevented from their employers from ever meeting their husband during their whole duration of stay. And Rhacel has similar examples in her book. So it brought back that very human dimension of some of my own work, and more broadly, sort of the structural feature of the extreme social hierarchies and status inequalities that we're dealing with here, and that are hard to address even if you want to mitigate them. And I think the book's fundamental argument that there is an extremely low floor of protection, or there's almost no floor of protection under the traditional sponsorship system, but at the same time there are moral economies that play out above this floor of protection that can result in very different employer domestic worker relationships. I think that's very, very to the point and very useful. And then the framing of those moral economies in terms of humanizing or treating as human, infantilizing and dehumanizing, I think that also rings true with my own experience. This kind of moral paternalism, the infantilization, is something that's very much, I think, invited by the extreme status inequalities and the fact that many, certainly first-time migrants coming from a very poor rural background in the Philippines have very, very little experience in dealing with people from outside of their original social context. They have very little knowledge beyond the introductory seminars that they get in back home pre-departure. So it's the situation almost invites a kind of benevolent, if very sort of paternalistic, infantilizing approach to domestic workers. And I think the infantilization concept is very useful in that context. And I think it can be, in my experience, it can be very well-meaning, even if it is demeaning and paternalizing fundamentally. And even in Rhacel's description of the pre-departure seminars, they sound quite paternalizing and infantilizing. You know, the way that the future domestic workers are taught there, are spoken to. It sounds quite. It sounds very, very top down. So I think it's part of a broader context of extreme status inequalities. Now, one paradox that really has been striking me ever since I've been traveling to the region is that, especially in households where the status inequality is very salient and where in some cases abuse is rife, parents still hand over their children to the care of domestic workers who they treat very badly, have very little trust in, and think are absolutely inferior to them. And I think an interesting future research project would be the impact of that on the relationship between the domestics and the children, and sort of almost the psychology of child rearing and the impact on the personality of children growing up in that context. I know that would be very, very hard to do, but I find it fascinating that parents hand over their children to people whom they detest and abuse in some cases. So that's it's very paradoxical. I think the critique that not all behavior is sort of economic, rational choice, utility maximizing behavior. I think that's very well taken, but I think there's a difference between the relationships in households between domestics and workers, where there are more complex moral economies playing out, and then sort of more institutional players like the recruitment agencies, where it does seem that sort of economic self-interest is really predominant. And I think that's an interesting contrast, that sort of the selfishness and the exploitation seems more prevalent among the agencies that really look after their own economic self-interest, whereas there's much more variety of moral behavior within the household. One phenomenon in the book that I've seen in many other social contexts in the Gulf, and that brought me back to some of my own research, is the phenomenon of brokerage, of people, of fixers, of brokers making information available, making access to administrative procedures available to individuals who are on a lower social rung, who are less well connected, and who need those fixers to help them. So there can be the fixers at home in the Philippines, it can be the recruitment agencies themselves, it can be brokers in the informal economy where runaway domestic workers need people to find accommodation for them, need people to do potentially paperwork for them. And this phenomenon of brokerage is something that's very widespread in the Gulf, also beyond the context of domestic workers, all the way to the way the state interacts with the private sector, the way other expatriates, non-domestic workers interact with the state or with citizens of the GCC. And I think it's something that comes about in a context, again, where there's extreme status inequality. There are individuals who are very far down on the pecking order, who still need access to certain resources, and where regulatory systems are inaccessible and very intransparent. So I think this combination of factors leads to the emergence of those kind of rent-seeking strata of brokers and fixers who make things available for people who are less well positioned. So I found that an interesting example of a broader phenomenon that goes all the way back to the pre-departure experience in the Philippines. Similarly, some of the workarounds that are described to deal with regulations in practice, like the fact that when the Philippines banned the export of domestic workers for a few years, they were just brought in on private sector cleaning contracts and then informally used for domestic work. Those types of workarounds, again, they're very, very widespread also in other walks of life across all segments of the labor market and many other markets in the region. So I found that interesting. And there's also there's the reverse phenomenon in Kuwait, where there is a minimum wage for expatriates working in the private sector, but no minimum wage for domestic workers. And then the opposite of what Rhacel describes in her book happens, which is that workers are brought in on domestic workers visas, and then they end up working in construction sites or elsewhere in menial jobs, because on a domestic work visa, they don't have to be paid the minimum wage. So I guess it highlights the broader issue that enforcement of rules is very, very tricky in a context where there's such extreme status inequality. People are very vulnerable, and a lot of those employment relationships, at least in parts, happen in the private sphere. And then the last point that I was going to make, the last thing that the book evoked in a very productive way, was that both employers and workers, they operate sort of in a web of myths and rumors. There's a lot of misinformation. And again, that's something that I've seen in the labor markets and other markets in the Gulf more generally. So there's all the mythology about domestic workers who run away that Rhacel rightly describes. It's almost pure fiction, the idea that they run away because life in the informal economy is great, they can make much more money, they run away even from very good employment relationships in the formal domestic economy, whereas in fact informal life is really quite terrible and very precarious, and wages are very low there. And there are many other rumors about sort of expatriate life that are held by both citizens and sort of white-collar, richer expatriates that are completely off base. There's a whole mythology about Bengali, as they call them, so Bangladeshi national mafias and how dangerous they are. And conversely, I think there are also a lot of myths among domestic workers that are not true. And there's a lot of misinformation when I spoke to the domestic workers in Doha, where they didn't know the first thing actually about their formal labor rights under Qatari legislation, which was really striking because there had been reported a lot in the local press, but really didn't percolate through to the actual workers who were concerned. And last point, in that context, I was wondering whether this fear that Rhacel describes among employers, that when their domestic workers do something terrible, they'll be criminally liable for it, whether that is actually true. I know that you might have to pay a certain fee if someone who is under your sponsorship does something criminal. But my hunch would be that, again, this fear that you're completely one-to-one criminally liable for what people under your sponsorship do, that this is just wrong. You know, that's not true. It's just possibly yet another myth in that kind of web of myths and fears that have been woven around domestic employment. So I'd have more to say, but I'll stop right here. So it's a really very rich and fascinating work that evoked a lot of memories to my own work that looked at other parts of the Gulf labor market.
Thank you, Steffen. That was very rich and illuminating. And thank you for bringing in your own perspectives and your own research over many years. I'm now going to invite Rhacel to answer some of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So Rhacel, do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to take you through some of the questions. The first question here is by Kirstine, who is a British Academy Global Professor at the International Inequalities Institute. That's my institute. And she's saying, thank you for presenting this excellent work. Could you say something about how the UAE government is thinking about this situation? I heard that there are discussions about delinking visas from jobs. or is this incorrect information? Would you like?
Yeah, so thank you, Kristen, for your question. So there has been a delinking or a revisiting of the Kafala system. And that's basically, you know, how when you go into a country in the Gulf region, you are bound to your sponsor and you can only work for your sponsor, which is what I talked about earlier. And so while that delinking has happened because of a lot of pressure from multilateral agencies such as the ILO, the government exempted domestic work from the delinking. And so while many other jobs are not linked to, you know, a sponsor anymore, and that employers have greater flexibility in the labor, employees have greater flexibility in the labor market, that still remains untrue for domestic workers. And there's many reasons for that, like it's not seen as real work. It's, you know, seen as a private household matter.
And Kirsten, Stephen has also replied to your question in the chat. We have a question from Salsan Abdul Rahim, who's actually an associate professor based at the American University of Beirut and has also joined us from Beirut. So she's saying, thank you very much. And I agree with the shortcomings of scholarship on gender and migration in the Arab region. I also agree with the need to provide a nuanced analysis of the detriments of employers' labor practices, which vary, and the data shows this. So that's a comment from her. And the question that follows is from Paddy, who is an LSE alumni based in Zambia. And she's saying to all the speakers, what new thinking can civil society and researchers take on the call to abolish the Kafala system, which underpins workers' relationships? Do you see an impact on worker-employer relationships with ethical recruitment approaches? So would you like to answer that first?
Sure. So one thing I want to say is that we need to, you know, decouple the kafala from the Middle East and actually look at a kafala-like system existing globally for migrant workers, right? And I think that's like one of the problems is that, you know, many people sort of just look at the kafala and think this is just happening in the Middle East. But as I said in the beginning, you know, for migrant domestic workers, this legal system is actually the norm for them. The only country that has had like that does not have domestic workers in a kafala-like situation is Italy. Canada is the only other country to revisit this. But so in Canada, traditionally, migrant domestic workers, when they came in, they were bound to the family that sponsored them. And then to get landed immigrant status, they had to work continuously for this household for 2 years as a live-in domestic worker. If they don't accomplish that within a 4-year span, they get deported back to their country of origin. So a lot of people, activists in Canada protested this, and then so they changed the law. But the law is now domestic workers can work for any household, not as a live-in worker, but at the cost of never qualifying for permanent legal status. So that's not really a result of activism that the domestic workers were embracing, right? So that sort of answers the civil society involvement with the kafala. But what I really want to emphasize in our discussion this, you know, early evening there is that it's really important to not see the kafala as just this exceptional, evil thing, cultural thing that's just going on in the Middle East. It's actually pretty global in terms of how migrant workers are accepted even in the United States. When we look at the temporary labor migration system that has been, you know, that has been in existence longer than the labor migration systems in the region of the world we are talking about. And so do you see an impact on worker-employer relationships with ethical recruitment approaches? Without question, I think that recruitment agencies, as Steffen was pointing out, really have a lot of power to determine, to educate migrant domestic workers, to protect migrant domestic workers, to advocate for migrant domestic workers, and it's complicated, but this oftentimes does not happen.
Thank you, Rhacel. There's a question from Armand, who's this is an LSE MSc in International Migration and Public Policy. But I think you've kind of answered that. The question is, can our understanding of kafala be generalized within the Gulf states, or do you think it should be approached from a country perspective? And I think you've kind of said that this, these instances are quite global. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
You kind of answered this. So do you want to say anything else, or should I move on to Daniela?
Let me just say, something about, a per country perspective. I mean, I do think that, so the question really also, puts a lot of weight in the law. And so what I do want to say is that what we should know by this point is that laws are not a sufficient solution to improve the conditions of domestic work. And we could turn to Canada for that. The work of Diva Stasulis and Abigail Bacan that on the legal governance, the governance of domestic workers in Canada, and the multiple protectionist laws that they have not translated necessarily to the better protection of workers there. And so we see since ILO Convention 189, the Decent Work for Domestic Workers Convention that was passed in 2011 and later ratified, that led to, so while most countries in the globe do not include domestic work in their labor law protections, what we have is countries basically putting into law domestic worker labor laws, and that includes Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. But yet we know that the enforcement of those laws will be really weak. And so in my book, I'm trying to say, well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have these protectionist laws, but I'm also saying that we have to be creative and look at other ways to improve domestic worker conditions. And my little contribution is that I found morals was another way that we could monitor and have domestic employers self-regulate their behavior.
Right. Thank you so much, Rhacel. There's a question from Daniela, who's at Bielefeld University. The question is, in Brazil, some studies have shown that domestic workers had in effect in liberating white Brazilian women to enter the job market, as this would free them from domestic tasks traditionally. And have you found anything similar in your research? So yes, were your informants working women? Were they maybe something about the background of that?
Well, so in my previous work, I talked about what I think Daniela is talking about is, or referring to, we could generally call the International Division of Reproductive Labor, or the care chain, which is something I talked about in my much earlier work, in which like privileged women enter the labor market and outsource domestic work to migrant women. And so the person who actually talked about that initially is Evelyn Akano-Glenn in her very important 1992 article that was published in Science called The Racial Division of Reproductive Labor. And so the International Division of Reproductive Labor adds to Nakano Glenn's work by basically saying that migrant domestic workers themselves then outsource the care work that they have to other less privileged women, as who they rely on as paid or unpaid laborers to care for the children that they left behind in transnational families.
Right. There's a very interesting question that's come up from Patrick, who's LSE Sociology Director and of the MSc International Migration and Public Policy. The question is, well, good evening. Do you have any sense of how your typology of household control might vary by the nature of the relationship between the couple heading the household? Male dominance, equal male-female, or female dominating, at least on domestic issues? In other words, is it simply unadulterated patriarchy in all cases?
Yeah. So thank you for your question. And so then, this would really depend, like, across, so we have such a diversity of households. So we have such a diversity of households in the United Arab Emirates, due particularly because of like the diverse nationalities of residents of the country. And so, what you do have, however, that seems to be constant is that women are often the ones managing their domestic workers. And oftentimes they have children. And so whether the women are working or not, they're the ones who are sort of determining what the household's relationship is with the domestic workers. In some cases, it's more extreme. So in some Emirati households, many Emirati households, the domestic workers are not allowed to look at the men in the eye. And so then, you could just imagine the interactions being so minimal. But, I mean, is it unadulterated patriarchy? I don't want to go that far, but I will say that, yeah, I mean, the fact that women are the ones managing is usually, it's not causing any kind of egalitarian division of labor here.
Sure. Rhacel, Lina has a few comments to make. Lina, please come on board.
Thank you, Shalini, and thank you, Rhacel. And basically, I just wanted to perhaps comment on something important that you have said, which is, and which I couldn't agree with. I mean, I can't tell you how much I agree with it, which is that laws are insufficient. I totally agree with you. And this has been a tension that has existed in our circles since time immemorial. Is the law sufficient? Should we spend so much energy on law reform? What does it mean, etc.? But I think that the comment that I want to make is that at the end of the day, we are living, again, I take our example, we are living in a context where you have something as, I insist, as horrendous as the Kafala law. We are living with the letter of the law, for instance, in Lebanon, that criminalizes same-sex homosexual relationship as contra naturam. We have laws that allow certain types of crimes against women to happen. Is it sufficient to change these laws? Of course not. It's not sufficient. But I would certainly argue that there's a condition sine qua non for beginning to change the status quo, which is to change these horrendous texts, which is actually to challenge these horrendous texts and to go beyond them. That is one aspect of of reform that needs to happen. The other transformative aspect is actually which societies do we want, which mindsets do we want? How do we get to a point where dignified work, where labor laws where rules of engagements are the same for everybody? When do we get to a point where we have a context that does not allow such abuses? I'm not saying that we're going to find this anywhere else, but I think that is, that is where our efforts are converging. So yeah, I think these were the points that I wanted to make. Thank you, Shalini.
Rhacel, there's a question, a very interesting question. Thank you, Lina, sorry. From Joymana. I haven't got her affiliation, but I'm just going to read you the comment. She thanks you very much. And she says, you mentioned that you interviewed Filipina domestic workers, but we know that Filipina women are often at the top of the racialized hierarchy of domestic workers, where darker women from other parts of the world are considered less educated, less skilled, and thus more often subjugated to mistreatment from employers. In that sense, she says, I found servants of globalization to be more critical of structural, racial, gender, and political economic forces that shape the employer-employee relationship. I wonder why these analytical frames seem absent or minimal in Unfree. How do you think race and racism plays into the domestic labor relationship in the UAE and under Kafala more generally?
Okay, so thank you for your question. Race is complicated, and that, it's like kind of a very Western formation, right? Of that, does it really speak of South to South relations, or is this a South to North relationship? And that's something I can't really fully answer. So thank you for your point about my lack of, and pointing out that I don't really talk about racialization in the context of the Gulf, and in particular, the racial hierarchies that might form, or we could call them the national hierarchies that might form among domestic workers in the perspective of employers. So, I didn't want to just talk about like how Western employers perceive their domestic workers, which, if I did, I could have a more clear discussion of the racialization of domestic workers. But then if you complicate the discussion and you have South Asian employers and Emirati employers, then it gets a little bit more complicated. But in terms of national differences, one thing I did find was that how sending countries manage domestic workers really results in different labor conditions. And we really have to pay more attention to that. And we have not sufficiently paid attention to that. And so the Philippine government gives a much more substantive pre-departure orientation seminar than does Indonesia or Nepal or Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, for example, is only like 2 hours. And so what's interesting is Indonesia's is 6 months, but much of that is spent on this is how you sweep the floor, this is a vacuum cleaner, and not so much on rights education on domestic workers. And so then a lot of, so I collaborated with Rhacel Sylvie, but we ended up choosing to write 2 separate books. She's eventually writing a book on Indonesians in the region. I wrote the one on Filipinos, but we actually collected our data in tandem with each other. So we were in the field together all the time. And what was very interesting that came up in Rhacel Sylvie's findings is a lot of the Indonesians were envious of Filipinos. And they were saying Filipinos are more tolerant, not tolerant, we're braver. Filipinos were less tolerant of poor conditions while we're fearful of demanding, better conditions, right? So is that a cultural thing that Filipinos are just braver subjects, or is that Filipinos are more educated about their rights? So that was a question Rhacel and I were toying with in the field. And then another thing was that sending states also enforce different labor standards for domestic workers. So when I met with Bangladeshi when I met with Bangladeshi government officials, they were telling me, and I'm always quoting them when they said, your government is crazy because, you know, they're enforcing such high labor standards that Filipinos are going to suddenly be like pricing themselves out of the market, because you can get 3 Bangladeshi for 1 Filipino. And when they told me that, they were referring to the fact that the Philippine government highly recommends and legally makes it, you know, obligatory for employers to sign a contract that says that they're going to pay domestic workers $400 a month. In contrast, Bangladesh only requires a $160 a month minimum wage. And so that's what they were referring to. So it's like an example of how countries have different labor standards. Sending countries have different labor standards that they impose, which then leads to different labor conditions. And so in terms of race, what we did find in the field, me and Rhacel Sylvie, what we found was there was a lot of co-ethnic alliance that occurred organically for among Indonesians, Filipinos, and Nepalese. Nepalese are not a big group, but if you look at them in parks, you will find during the day off that they're often sitting with Indonesians and Filipinos, and that they've been adopted to the group, even though they don't share a common language, and the Nepalese are often just sitting there silently. But they will not interact with the Ethiopians, nor the Kenyans. And in the Ethiopians in particular, a lot of the Filipinos and Indonesians we met had a lot of distrust of them. And they were basically saying that there was a lot more alliance between Ethiopians and their Emirati employers because they share the same religion, and they share the same like phenotype. And so in my experiences of visiting Emirati households, my surprise was there are a lot of, you know, very dark Emiratis women, like, you know, that they're Black. I mean, I walked in their households and you could see, you know, because a lot of times you see women wearing their traditional outfits, but you don't know which Arab country they're from. But then when you actually go to their households, you're like, oh, so this is like an Emirati household. And what I did find was a lot of them were Black. And so it really complicated our ability, me and Rhacel Sylvie's, to really talk about racial hierarchies there, because we were not talking about like a Western, we were not looking at a Western country. And so what we found was inequalities were more determined by national differences among domestic workers. What we couldn't talk about was the national tension between Ethiopians, Kenyans, Blacks, Black domestic workers, African domestic workers, and Asian domestic workers. And so we hope that other people do research, more people who are like more, you know, doing racial studies, racial and ethnic studies will look at, you know, cross-racial ethnic relations among domestic workers in the region.
Rhacel, we still have about 12 minutes. Would you like to answer some of the questions and comments from Steffen from his commentary?
Yes, I really appreciate, you know, this emphasis on the extreme status inequalities that domestic workers find themselves in. And the comments of Steffen also, you know, something I didn't mention and that he mentioned was that, you know, a question is like a lot of women, like a lot of the domestic workers, you know, they put themselves in this situation, not with like, you know, not like completely clueless that they could get abused. Like, you know, you read in the newspapers in the Philippines, you watch the news, you hear of bodies coming back, you get an orientation, and in the orientation, they tell you you will be raped. They don't even say you will likely get raped. They will say, you know, you will get raped. I mean, that was like kind of, I went to so many of these pre-departure orientation classes. And so, you know, the teacher asked them, you know, you're probably going to get raped. Are you, you know, are you having second thoughts about going there? And the women are saying no, because, you know, they'll say, you know, God will protect me. We have different destinies. Most destinies don't end up in rape. So let's all pray to God right now that we don't get raped. So then who are people that put themselves in such extreme vulnerable situations, right? And so something I should emphasize about the group of migrants who end up in this region of the world, they are, in contrast to what migration scholars say, where the poorest of the poor cannot ever leave the country of origin. That is not true. I think recruitment agencies, debt-driven migration actually has opened the door to and made migration a possibility for the most disenfranchised members of society. The people who you find working as domestic workers in the Gulf are often people who are from areas of the Philippines without a wage economy. And so they are extremely desperate, extremely poor. And for them, you know, they suffer from, you know, like, basically it's like the violence of poverty, right? And the violence of poverty is a worse option than the violence of servitude and the possibility of rape, right? And that is something that I wish to emphasize, because I think it is a question, why would people put themselves in this horribly vulnerable situation? And it's because they were in a pretty horrible situation to begin with. And so then second thing was about the extreme status inequality that was raised. You know, it really raises this question then of what makes a good employer. And what I found was that you as an employer have a moral responsibility, not just to put the food on the table, but there's actually a lot of labor where you have to be consciously undoing, like, and fighting that extreme status inequality. So it's almost like every day you have to tell your domestic worker, yes, you can eat this. No, you don't have to ask me for permission. You can eat this, you can eat. I mean, it's like a labor thing that employers, like, what they don't realize is that if they're not proactive in their dismantling of the status inequality will remain the same, even if they said once when the domestic worker first entered the household, you know, you are not like a slave, you can eat whatever you want, you can call your family. You know, it's like, I found that good employers have to be the ones every day. Did you talk to your children today? I want to make sure you talk to your children today, you know, and if you don't do those kinds of like interventions, it's likely to stay an extremely unequal and extremely oppressive for domestic workers, because the bar of labor standards are so low to begin with. And so even though that I'm saying that not all domestic workers are like horribly treated, I'm definitely not saying that this is like an ideal situation. What I'm just saying is that, contrary to my colleagues, however, it's not the worst all the time. You know, it's not this like horrendous thing, you know, all the time. It's not all slavery, but it's definitely not ideal, is the point I want to make.
So you almost have to be a bit patronizing in dismantling the patriarchal expectations.
Yes.
Thank you, Rhacel. As the chair, can I take the liberty to just put forward some of my own comments, which I had after also reading your book? We still have a few minutes. As an anthropologist, my assessment is that I find your book very nuanced, especially the ethnography. For example, on page 98, you let the readers gently know that one domestic worker is not being denied food by their employer, but is exercising a particular type of agency and judgment where she can avoid being in the direct glare of her employers who will ask her to watch over the children. And many people would read this as abuse, but domestic workers here are strategically well-tuned in finding ways to avoid the overwork that defines their lives. Another point is that, you know, some of your figures here, 2,349 domestic workers absconded, 35 were sexually abused. Your argument here is that migration and poverty are interlinked and women still remain aspiring subjects throughout this dire narrative of global inequality. And you tease out the dynamics of unfreedom of poverty versus unfreedom of criminalization. And you move away from a typically fixed narrative around representations of kafala as slavery and victimhood, focusing more on women's lived experiences, their voices, their everyday movements in contact zones of extreme hierarchy, allowing us to rethink different types of freedom and what relational perspectives can convey about employment relationships. I feel this is somewhat a shift from the dominant narrative in GCC literature of women just being victims and not agents of their destinies in some ways. And I think, you know, your focus on material constraints and journeys of aspirations are very illuminating. I like the way you analyze what a good employer is. It's very rare in the literature. And there's a sharpness to how domestic workers view their work and relationships with their employers and vice versa. And as you point out, and I think this is a great analytical point, that good employers are not understood by domestic workers as meaning those who treat them as equals. And if I can just draw on my own context here of Euro-American expatriates in India that I've been studying for a decade in relation to domestic work, they often build a relationship with domestic workers thinking that, you know, they are offering Western notions of equality and very liberal notions of Western equality in these employment relationships. But domestic workers, on the other hand, know they're inferior subjects. And in these very liberal contexts, and this is not Kafala, this is India, there is a high culture of blacklisting and regimes of punishment. So you may have very liberal discourses and practices, a day off, overtime, all those kind of things, but you can be blacklisted in a very arbitrary way. So that, you know, there should be a lot of nuance to the fact that these things just don't happen in the Middle East, like you said. Finally, and I'll send you my comments because I have quite a few. What does it mean to have a good job in the global domestic service sector is one of the questions I leave for you. And also, what, you know, did you find also things like tutoring, nutritional advice, nursing as part of these employment relationships under the kafala, or was it just this very, you know, was it just everyday domestic work? I'll leave you with some of those questions.
Thank you for your comments. I mean, who like, I'll just comment on the last one. You know, I don't think domestic employers have a very high, like, it's not like the domestic workers who you find in Europe from the Philippines or the United States tend to be more educated, or Canada. And so they can offer more expertise, and like employers rely on them as a skill. You know, somehow like employers know I'm getting this semi-skilled person for really cheap, right? So I can get advice, you know, because on them, because they were actually a teacher in the Philippines and now they're a domestic worker here in Canada. In contrast, employers really infantilize their domestic workers in the region and don't think very highly of them. And if someone is going to be educating someone, it's the employer who patronizes the domestic worker, like Steffen was saying, and that this, you know, kind of patronizing paternalism, you know, it goes to, you know, sometimes they'll say, you know, I'm not letting you out of the house because it's for your own good, for your own, I don't want you to get tempted by an Indian worker out there. Or like, you like to eat chips, I'm gonna ban you from eating chips because, you know, it's bad for your health, or your fried pork, you know, or whatever. So yeah, so I feel it's the domestic workers are really not, you know, so even if they've been a domestic worker for like 10 different employers and they're quite old, and there is, I think, a very, you know, you could even say, like, I guess, racialized constitution, you know, perspective of them is very much inferior, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to have to thank everybody at this moment. Rhacel, Steffen, Lina, thank you very much for joining us today, for accepting this invitation. It's been a fascinating evening here. Till next time, goodbye, and see you next time, and have a lovely week ahead. Thank you very much to all of you who joined across the world. Bye-bye.